Hi everyone, my name is Devin. I'm with Brewster Ladies Library, and this program is sponsored by the Brewster Ladies Library Association and its members. I'd also like to give a shout out to the other Cape libraries that help co-sponsor this talk in no particular order: Cotuit, Vineyard Haven, Falmouth, Provincetown, Sturgis, Eldridge, Mashpee, and Weldon Memorial. And tonight we're here to learn about Things I Wish I Knew, a virtual discussion on beekeeping with Amanda Wastrom. If you're curious about beekeeping and not sure how to get started, this local beekeeper will share the surprises, joys, and challenges they have observed over their 10 years of beekeeping and keeping honeybees here on Cape Cod. Learn more about what makes honeybees such amazing creatures and what you can do at home to support all pollinators. A little bit about our presenter. Amanda Wastrom is a curator, writer, and artist based in East Sandwich, where she lives with her family, a flock of chickens, an overgrown garden, and a few hives of honeybees. Most days you can find her at Heritage Museum and Gardens, where she works as a curator. For more info, you can go to www.amanda-wastrom.com or check out her Instagram at Amanda_Wastrom. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. My menu is hiding my buttons here. Play slideshow. Okay. Everybody can see that, hopefully. Yes. All right. So welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Amanda, and I am a member of the Barnstable County Beekeepers Association here on Cape Cod. I've been keeping bees at my home and around my property for about 10 years now. And I'd love to talk bees, so I'm looking forward to sharing about them today. Just a little orientation before we get started. I'm going to start with a little introduction just about me, how I got into beekeeping, and my sort of initial impressions of it. A little bit about bees themselves, and the kind of it's a short talk. You could talk for hours and days, and people do, about beekeeping. So this is just a very kind of brief overview of bees and the hives themselves. And then going to share some simple ways of helping pollinators and specifically bees, things that we can do, whether you're a beekeeper or not, to support bees at home and in your community. And then I will finish up with some kind of suggestions for further reading and some resources if you want to keep digging a little deeper. So here I've got 3 photographs. And so this is a little sort of preview of my life. The one is a picture of the trunk of my car, and you can see there's all kinds of bags and boxes and shoes, but a huge chunk of the back of my car is filled with plants. And another picture has one of my roosters. I also keep chickens. And then a picture down below is a family photograph. So a group of men from my family who were all farmers. We've always had animals in my family. When I was in high school, my friends called our house the zoo, and we had everything. We had a ferret, a saltwater fish tank, dogs, cats, and whatever animal my mom, who was a 3rd grade teacher, usually kept as a classroom pet. So that was anything from a hermit crab to a guinea pig. And I think throughout my life, I've just always been a nurturer. I've always loved taking care of animals, loved gardening, loved taking care of plants. I've been keeping chickens for even longer than I've been keeping bees. And it's something that I get a lot of enjoyment about it from. And additionally, the family photo, farming is definitely in my blood, and I think it's just something that runs in my family. And I would describe myself as sort of a wannabe farmer. And so, between my vegetable garden and my chickens, the bees just seem to be the natural next step. So here's a couple of little video of the beehives at my house, and a photograph of a cranberry harvest, and a photograph of my house itself, just to give you a little sense of our property. We live in East Sandwich, off of Old County Road, which is sort of borderline rural area. We have just under 2 acres, and our property does abut that cranberry bog that's in the photograph. So it really is an ideal place to raise bees, and I think that's one reason why I got into it. It seemed like a natural addition to the other things that I was doing. And I think the way that I just happened to get into it was my father-in-law gave me a book about bees one Christmas, and the next thing I knew, I had signed myself up for bee school in January, which is a program that's run by Barnstable Beekeepers Association. And that was in 2013, and I've been keeping bees ever since. So jumping into my talk, 5 things I didn't know before I started beekeeping that maybe I wish I knew, but that have been pleasant surprises since I've gotten started. There's a lot that has surprised me about bees, and the word seems to be out at this point that bees are an important part of our ecosystem and why they're important. But I did want to give you a little insight into sort of what beekeeping is all about, starting with are the bees themselves. So my first thing that I have realized as a beekeeper is just how absolutely amazing honeybees themselves are. So in this photograph, we've got three bees, the different inhabitants of the average hive. And so let's meet Apis mellifera, or also known as the honey bearer. So honeybees have been here on Earth for around 100 million years. They are the only insect that produces food eaten by man. And they are just one of more than 16,000 species of bees. We actually have 4,000 bees just in North America alone. And of course, honeybees are critical to pollination, and it is estimated that about 1/3 of all of the food that you eat was pollinated by a bee. They're very social. There's a really interesting hierarchy and division of labor between sort of the reproduction individual, the queen, and the rest of the workers. They are a very cooperative organism, so they cooperatively take care of the larva, or what we call the brood. And just going into a little more depth of the different types of honeybees in a hive. The first one is the queen. She has her really most distinctive feature is just this extremely large abdomen, which of course is well suited for her particular task, which is to lay all the eggs all the time. So one queen, there's always one queen per hive, and she lays in the busy sort of summer season between 1,000 and 1,500 eggs a day. She typically lives between 2 and 4 years, and her scent and her pheromone really dictates the sense of well-being. She controls the whole hive. She is the leader, and she, like I said, she controls that through the pheromones that she releases. And interestingly, she must eat 80 times her weight to continue the sort of egg laying that she does. So the worker bees are constantly sort of tending her and making sure she's got what she needs. So she is a queen in that sense. She has a kind of cohort of bees that surround her all the time. The next bee is the drone. The drone is a larger bee that you find in the hive. They again, some people mistake them for the queen, but they are not. They don't have that really distinctive abdomen. It has a slightly different shape. But if you go back to that first slide that I showed, you can definitely see the difference in size between the drone and the worker, for example. And the drones are the males. There's about 100 to 200 of them per hive. and their sole job in life is to mate with queens from other hives. They have no stingers. And once, this is the sort of tragic part, is once a drone mates with a queen, the process is a little violent and it damages his abdomen and he dies after the process. That's a theme with bees, is they, like Mother Nature, often tends to be, they're a bit ruthless in the way their world works, for sure. But they also have no stingers. So they, again, other than mating, they really have no purpose. They don't get food. They can't protect the hive. They're really just there to help with reproduction. And lastly are my favorite, which are the worker bees. There are anywhere from 20,000 to 60,000 worker bees per hive, and that number really varies throughout the season. The worker bees are all female. So the hive itself is predominantly female. They live for about 6 weeks, and they earn that name for sure. Interestingly, part of the hierarchy of the hive is that worker bees have a very particular pattern of what their job is, depending on how old they are. So the very first job that a worker bee has when it is hatched is that it cleans the cell in the honeycomb that it was born out of. And its next job is to be a nurse bee, and that's from about day 3 to about day 11 of its life. And the nurse bees are the ones who are taking care of the larva, taking care of the brood. In the larva phase, all the little baby bee larvae have to be fed, and in a particular way. There's a lot of work that needs to be done just tending of the brood, so that's the nurse bee's job. The next job up from that is wax production, days 12 to 17. And in that, the worker bees actually have glands on their abdomen, that bottom section, that produces wax. And obviously that beeswax is what they use to construct the hive, to cap any honeycomb, whether it's for brood or for honey. And so that's their main job at that point. The next job after that is being a guard bee. 18 to 21 days old, and they are, like I said, involved in guarding and protecting of the hive. So they're the ones down at the entrances. If you look closely at a beehive, you might sometimes see the little bees down there who are shooing away other insects, keeping out predators, keeping out all the wasps and the yellow jackets and anything that they can. Their very last job at the end is as a forager. So the forager bees are the ones that are leaving the hive, going out and finding nectar and pollen and bringing it back. And so the ones that you see when you're out in your garden or out and about, and if you see honeybees, you're seeing the oldest bees, the forager bees. Amazing things about honeybees is their sophisticated senses. They have an amazing sense of smell, sense of touch, and sense of sight. And so, for example, when it comes to smell, honeybees have what they say are, in terms of odorant receptors, so the amount of receptors that they have in their bodies to accept different scents. They have 170 of those, compared with only, comparing other insects, compared with 62 in fruit flies and 79 in mosquitoes. They use odor and smell as a way to recognize their family. So for example, if a bee inadvertently flies into another hive, they will know right away that it's not their hive just by the sense of smell. It's a way that they communicate with each other. Again, those pheromones that the queen releases are a communication method. And of course, they can use their sense of smell to find food. So their sense of smell is so precise that they can differentiate between hundreds of different flower varieties, and also tell whether a particular flower carries nectar or pollen from meters away. Very strong sense of smell. Their sense of touch is also really sophisticated. You can see all those little hairs, their antennae. They also have lots of little hairs on their legs. And if you picture a beehive, they actually live in the dark most of the time. So they use their sense of touch. They can sense vibration. They can communicate by walking on each other or actually touching each other. and they can feel those vibrations, like I said, through their hair and through their antennae. And then lastly, their sense of sight. They actually have 5 different eyes, 2 different kinds of eyes, both simple and compound eyes. Their eyes are light sensitive. They can distinguish many more colors than humans, and they can see UV light. So in this particular slide, showing a dandelion flower, you can see on one side, the dandelion flower is yellow. That's how we humans see it. On the other side, the one that it's got white on the outside and sort of a bullseye red on the inside. That's the sort of UV filter on the same photograph. And so that just gives you a sense of what the bees are seeing. And interestingly, it's basically a bullseye, right? Telling the bees exactly where to go to get right to that pollen. It is also believed that they use the sun's UV rays as a way of determining what direction to go. That's how they connect back and forth to the hive and the flower where they happen to be going. So this is just a video that I shot in my yard of a honeybee, a worker bee, a forager, kind of doing her thing. So while you're watching that video, I can tell you just some amazing kind of fun facts just about the amount of work that a honeybee hive is capable of doing. So an average honeybee visits between 500 and 100 flowers during one collection trip. So one trip, 50 to 100 flowers. 1 pound of honey takes 25,000 of those trips just for 1 pound of honey. So someone else, not me, has done all this math and calculated that during those trips, worker bees travel approximately 55,000 miles, if you totaled up all those trips, visiting more than 2 million flowers. So 55,000 miles, if you think of the circumference of the Earth, the circumference of the Earth is 24,901 miles. So the bees have basically circumnavigated the globe twice in the process of making just 1 pound of honey. And of course, the interesting thing is a beehive can have anywhere from 20 up to 60 pounds just for harvesting, and that doesn't even include the honey that they are making for themselves. I mean, it's not unusual to have a beehive have about 100 pounds of honey. So that is just a lot of amazing work. Go bees. The other thing that I think is really fascinating about the honey process in particular is that you think about the nectar that they're collecting. So nectar is 60% water, whereas honey is 17% water. So you can just think about the work that it takes the bees. So they're collecting all the nectar. It gets into the hive, and they basically, they transform it in their bodies, but also with evaporation to get the honey to exactly the right spot, and capping that honey at just the right moment when it is evaporated and is just right. That's pretty amazing as well. The last thing that I think is also really interesting about bees is that they are really crafters. They're makers. They make 5 different substances themselves. So they make their honey, they make their wax. I mentioned that they have glands on their abdomen that actually produces wax. They produce what's called royal jelly. That's something else that they make nectar out of. And you can probably imagine with the word royal, the royal jelly is a very special substance that is fed specifically to the queen. And specifically when they are raising a queen. So if a hive does not have a queen, it can raise one as long as it has a freshly laid egg. And really the only difference between a freshly laid egg that turns into a queen and a freshly laid egg that turns into a worker is the amount of time that they are fed royal jelly. So the queen is given significantly more. That's a fascinating process in itself. Of course, some other things that they produce a material called propolis, which is basically like the bee's version of glue. It is a really strong substance. It has antimicrobial properties, and it's used to seal all different kinds of parts of the hive. If you have two boxes, for example, together, the bees will go ahead and propolize, we say, the seams. And it's a protection barrier for them. And of course, they also produce the venom that they use in their stingers. So the second thing that I think is really amazing about bees is to think of the hive on a bigger scale. So we just went from talking about the individual bees. Now we're going to talk about the hive as a whole. And the hive is basically a superorganism. So if you think about going back to sort of high school biology class, the definition of an organism refers to a living thing that has organized structure, can react to stimuli, can reproduce, grow, adapt, and maintain homeostasis. And individual bees can do all those things. But then the hive itself can also do all those things. So thinking about structure and communication. Yep. Structure itself, of course, is well known. The beautiful honeycomb, the beautiful geometry of that, and the way that they build honeycomb in a very specific spacing called bee space. And as I mentioned, the sort of hierarchical structure of the hive, the workers and their different jobs, the way that the hive is structured is really sophisticated. And their methods of communicating are also really amazing. So what I'm showing in this video here is called the waggle dance. And it is one way that different foragers communicate to the other foragers when they come back to the hive, where they have been and where to go. And you can see them making basically kind of a figure-8 pattern and wiggling. And I am not a translator of the bee waggle dance, but the belief is that there's something about the way that they're wiggling and the direction that they're wiggling in that it makes sense to the bees. So just really interesting that they're all their methods of communication in the hive. Reproduction, as we talked about, the queen lays lots of eggs, but the hive itself actually reproduces as well. So if anyone has ever seen a swarm of bees out and about, this is what is happening. The hive itself is reproducing. What happens in a swarming situation is that the hive basically kind of splits into two. So half of the bees stay home, and then the queen and the other half of the bees leave with the idea that the queen and those bees will go find a new place to go. The bees that are left behind will go ahead and raise a new queen. So you have where you had one hive before, then you have two. Thinking about how an organism grows and adapts and how the hive itself does that. This is a simple chart. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds with this one, just to show that that black line is showing the population in the hive and how it changes throughout the season. You can see it, or throughout the year, I should say. It starts in January and goes all the way through December. And there is quite a bit of variation at different times of the year, with the hives surging in population in the summer, as you would expect. They need lots of workers out there gathering pollen and honey and things like that. The hive really decreases in numbers in the winter, when really what they're just trying to do in the winter is kind of hunker down and survive. And you can also see the correlation between the way that the population grows and the food source as well. So they're responding to what's going on in their environment, and the hive itself is adapting to that. And the hive is able to adapt and maintain homeostasis. The bees are very particular about what temperature they need. The brood needs to be at a very specific temperature. The honey, as they're making honey, needs to be at a very specific temperature. And the bees have lots of different ways of kind of adjusting their temperature. Sometimes when it's really hot and you open the hive, you'll see little bees flapping their wings, almost like little air conditioners. So the hive itself is really an amazing way, has built-in ways of maintaining homeostasis. The comb is really their, I mean, when you think of the honeycomb, that really is their foundation of all of the things that go on in a hive. It's, you know, it's an interesting thing for, they're not obviously the only animal that makes a nest. What's kind of interesting about bees is that they're making the nests, they're actually making the material that they then use for their nests. So it would be like us, you know, making wood ourselves that we then build our house in. Honeybees spend most of their lives on the honeycomb, about 90% of their lives. And they, you know, that honeycomb is very precise in its size. The comb provides shelter for them. It's used for honey production, storage. It's their nursery. It's their communication system. The comb itself, similar to propolis, beeswax also has antimicrobial properties. So it's a way to defend against pathogens and sort of their immune system, if you want to call it. The comb also holds memory, and there's a history there in smell of wax and all kinds of information that the bees can gather from the honeycomb itself. There's also been a lot of research done and information about pesticides getting stored in that honeycomb, which also makes sense if you think about bees are going out to flowers, they're coming back, they're using that nectar that they got from flowers, and they're creating beeswax from it. If there was any kind of pesticides involved in the flowers that they visited, that pesticide gets then sort of infused, so to speak, into the honeycomb. And over years, that level of pesticide builds up and builds up and builds up. So as beekeepers, one of the things that we do is sort of shift our frames in sort of a 5-year cycle, just so that we're making sure that that level of pesticide, if it's present, is not getting too high. The other thing that's really interesting about the hive as an organism is that beehives definitely have distinctive personalities, and I have 2 hives at the moment who each hive could not be more distinct. One hive, I open it up and, you know, you can almost hear them sort of snarling at me, you know, sort of, get out, we don't want you here. The other hive, you open up and they're like, hey, how's it going? Good to see you. So I think that's just something that's really interesting too. You know, like the hive itself really does have its own personality. So my third little factoid of what I have learned from beekeeping is that it is really hard. As I said in my introduction, I've kept all sorts of animals, some of which are very hard, from, you know, saltwater fish to goats and sheep. And bees are by far the hardest that I have ever raised. And here's why I think they are. So there's so much to know. And what I'm showing you here is, you know, when you first open a beehive, this is what you're looking at. And as a new beekeeper, looking at this is completely baffling. You have no idea what's going on. And there's just, it's, you know, it's a skill like anything else that comes with just experience and expertise. But it's really overwhelming to look at those hives at first and try to understand the bees' worlds and their system. And there's a lot that can go wrong with bees. There's all kinds of pests that are trying to get at them. And nothing is ever the same. The bees don't know that you're the beekeeper and that they should be doing things according to your schedule. They are their own animals, and, you know, there are 30-year veteran beekeepers that are constantly learning new things. Everyone does things a little differently. There's a lot of trial and error and figuring out what's right for you. But there, as I said, there are a lot of things that prey on honeybees, and it just always seems like there's a new threat and things that are out to get them. Some of you, if you have followed honeybees, the major threat we're dealing with at the moment is a parasitic mite called Varroa destructor. It's basically kind of like a tick, only picture a tick the size of your head. That's about the scale difference on a honeybee. And a major problem that Varroa causes is they just sort of wear the bees down and weaken their immune system, so that maybe the whole hive doesn't survive the winter, or maybe some other kind of problem wipes them out. It just the load of these parasites just becomes too much for the hive itself. So another thing is beekeeping on Cape Cod specifically is hard. So what I'm showing here are two slides or two images of development on Cape Cod. On one side is 1951, on the other side is more recently 1999. You can see that the amount of sort of open space and undeveloped land in the 50s was significantly less, not surprisingly, than today. So that everything that's in yellow is residential housing, for example. So as the Cape gets more developed, there is just less sort of food sources for the bees themselves. Not to mention that the Cape is not a big agricultural area. So a lot of places that have large honeybee populations are places where there's significant agricultural activity going on. The Cape is not not really like that, right? There are cranberries, that's maybe one of the largest crops. Not a huge amount of agriculture. And also a photo of winter on Cape Cod. Winter on Cape Cod, a lot of humans don't like it. Bees don't particularly like it either. The interesting thing is that winter on Cape Cod is almost like just a bunch of bad scenarios for bees. Winters in some areas where it actually gets colder and it snows more would be better. The real challenge with beekeeping on Cape Cod is that it's very wet in the winter. And again, because we don't have a lot of kind of open meadow habitat or agricultural options, the food sources in different seasons, like winter, like spring, like fall, there's not really a lot of food for them. So what we as beekeepers end up doing is supplementing them. And that was a big surprise for me as I'm hauling 25-pound bags of sugar out of BJ's to feed the bees. I was like, I didn't think this was part of the gig. So yeah, our area in particular is a challenge. Another thing is that for me, beekeeping, and I think if you asked a lot of beekeepers, they would agree that it's not all about the honey. I think maybe the honey is why people get into beekeeping. I know it was probably one of the reasons why I was interested. And, don't get me wrong, the honey is amazing. And I will show a little video here of, this is kind of the honey extracting setup. I don't think I have time to go into the whole process, but the extractor is basically kind of a centrifugal situation where you scrape down the frames, you put them in that spinner, and all the wax gets, or I should say all the honey gets spun out to the sides, and then you can open it up and get this beautiful liquid gold, as we call it, coming out that you can then use. But the thing about it is that there are many years where you maybe don't get any. And depending on when you take it, your bees might suffer. I've noticed sometimes that if I don't make exactly the right choice, which again, I've been beekeeping for 10 years, which basically means I'm still an absolute rookie. So if I make the wrong choice in terms of when I harvest my honey or how much I take, the bees might suffer that. And it's a really important balance to maintain of, do they actually have enough honey for themselves? Are you leaving them enough? And so I think for a lot of us, the honey, I look at it as this amazing added bonus. But I have found, as you can tell from the other parts of my talk, that just learning about them and observing them, seeing them out in my yard, that is rewarding in itself. And it's really fascinating. So I think that's why a lot of us stick with it, not necessarily for the honey. And my last number 5 is that honeybees are not native to North America. This maybe seems obvious to a lot of people, but it was actually a surprise for me. And it was, I feel like, a couple of years before I learned this. So yeah, bees are not native to North America, and they're certainly not native to Cape Cod. They were brought by European colonizers in 1622. What's interesting is that because, and maybe not because they're non-native, but there's this interesting paradox and connection that they also prefer a lot of non-native species. So what I'm showing here are the top image is autumn olive. The image in the bottom left is knotweed, and the image in the bottom right is locust. These are plants that are not exactly desirable, but that grow on Cape Cod quite a bit. My area in East Sandwich, for example, has tons of black locust trees, which are great for the bees, but are really not, again, not native to our environment. And it's sort of this balance that I think we are trying to manage. Is a lot of us who get into beekeeping are pretty ecologically minded and environmentally, we'd like to think of ourselves as environmentally responsible. So how do we manage that in a place where there's not a lot of food for the bees? You know, there's interesting discussions going on in the beekeeping community about that kind of stuff. But talking about what some of the what learning about honeybees has done for me has made me much more aware of the native bee species that we do have. And as I mentioned earlier, there are 4,000 other species of bees that are native to North America and that also play really important roles in pollinating. Just a sampling of the ones that are out there are shown here, and actually not just bees, but other pollinators as well. And you know, we hear a lot about the plight of the honeybee, and it's an important one. It's important for humans in particular, right? Because it's directly tied to our food supply. But the native bees don't get as much attention as even though they really do play a critical role in our local environment and our local ecosystems. This slide and the next one, you'll see the website down at the bottom is called Beecology. Is a really great program run by Dr. Robert Gegier. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, so I apologize, but he's come and spoken to the beekeepers a couple different times. He is studying, he's a WPI, and he out in Western Mass, and he's studying native pollinators, specifically here in Massachusetts. He does a lot of citizen science. He has a Beecology app where you can actually go in and document pollinators that you have seen in your neighborhood, in your backyard. And it's great to have that identification as a tool to track what species are where. And so some of the work that he's done, again, I'm just grabbing this particular slide. Oops. I'm not going to get into the minutia of all these different bumblebee species because that's definitely not my area of expertise. But I think the big takeaway from this particular slide, if you can look at the charts over on the right-hand side, these are all different native species of bumblebees in Massachusetts. You can see the blue lines are the historical levels. And the red lines are their sort of more recent levels. So you can see that for the majority of native bumblebee species, their populations have really plummeted recently. There's a couple species where their population has grown. So Bombus impatiens, for example, which is a very common bumblebee that you'll see out and about. It's one of the big sort of jolly roly-poly ones. That one is in particular a generalist, so it tends to pollinate a lot of different kinds of things, which is one reason why it is thought that it is doing well and is actually increasing in population. A lot of the other bumblebee species are much more specific in the flowers that they pollinate, and as a result, their populations, as habitat decreases, their populations decrease as well because their source of food is decreasing. Here. So that jumps me to the next part of my talk, which I did want to offer just some simple, relatively simple ways of helping pollinators, whether they're honeybees or whether they're native bees, in your yard, in your neighborhood, with friends. The first one is to leave the dandelions and clovers, and this is one that I hold close to my heart because I feel like dandelions get a bad rap by a lot of people, and some people are quite maniacal about ridding them from their yards. And in reality, dandelions are really awesome. They are an important, really early pollen source for pollinators. So if you think about those dandelions, they're one of the first things blooming in the spring. So here on Cape Cod, they're one of the only things blooming in the spring. So if you can bear it and go for more of the Cape Cod lawn and less of the sort of manicured lawn, leave the dandelions, leave the clover. We have started planting clover in our yard. There was some there already, but we've started adding seed. It's done really well, and it's a lot lower maintenance than lawn, and it actually provides some ecological benefit for your pollinators too. So that's something to consider. The second one is a big one. Don't use pesticides at all, ever. We have lived in our house since 2010. We haven't done any sort of inorganic methods of the way that we maintain our landscape at all. And I really do believe that it has made a difference. We have all kinds of animals, not just pollinators, but all kinds of amphibians in our yard, snakes, peepers. The organic approach to managing your landscape is a really important one. And the pesticides, as I described earlier in my talk, the way that pesticides usually really get the bees, you know, it would be unlikely that they're going to be directly sprayed by the pesticides. What happens is the pesticide residue doesn't go away. It just settles in on the plants, and particularly in the pollen and the nectar that the bees then bring back to their hives. So it's sort of a slow poisoning of the population. On that note, one thing to look out for is to watch out for plants that have been grown with neonicotinoids. And you will sometimes see these tags if you're at a garden center, that it'll say things like, this plant's not going to be eaten by aphids, or, you know, and it lists a few of the really sort of pest bugs. But if you look below that, it says that's because it's been grown with neonicotinoids. So the plant itself is being grown with pesticides. So it's obviously a similar kind of problem. So that's one thing to look out for when you're selecting your plants. Another great way is to, if you are a gardener yourself, is to try to plant some pollinator or bee-friendly plants and trees. And here are a bunch of different options, everything from goldenrod, Joe Pye weed, asters, purple hyssop. These are also all native plants to our area, and so they're great from that standpoint as well. My last part, and I think I lost it and I had to restart my computer, was that on that note, if you are a gardener, something I think to look at is to try a more sort of ecological gardening approach. I know that's an idea that's gaining popularity, and the idea there is to really consider yourself as almost a steward of your property from an environmental standpoint, and how can you just kind of shift your approach. It really is a different mindset of instead of taking a really interventionist approach, how can you kind of work with the landscape, work with the creatures that are in your property, and make choices that really benefit everybody. And I'm gonna hop out because I am realizing this is not the right one. Oh, here's the right one that I want. Here are my most recent slides. Okay. Are we still sharing? Can everybody still see? Uh-oh, did I lose everybody?
I can see you, but not your
Okay,
share
looks
at
like I
this
stopped.
point.
Let me start again. I had duplicate versions. Okay. So
There we go.
slightly different version of the same slide. Oop. Updated version. But here is that tag that I was talking about. So watch out for this tag when you're at your garden centers. Another thing to mention with the pesticides is don't use those mosquito spraying companies. They don't really work. It's been documented that the process doesn't really work. And B, it's not clear, and it's fairly convincing that it is going to damage any positive and beneficial insects that you have on your property at the time, which will most likely be honeybees, other kinds of pollinators, and other kinds of beneficial organisms. And I did want to jump to, if you want to really dive into learning more about bees, here is a little sampling of some of the books that I've enjoyed, and also some books that I'm looking forward to reading. The two by Thomas Seeley, one called The Lives of Bees, and then the other one called Honeybee Democracy. Thomas Seeley is a really interesting researcher and scientist. He's out in Ithaca, New York, and he has been following and documenting wild honeybees that live out in the woods and the areas around Ithaca. And that's what the Lives of Bees, that particular book, is about. And he has just made some really interesting observations and suggestions on how we as beekeepers can try to make our more closely match what the bees do in the wild. Because what he had found in his research is, for example, that major mite that I described, Varroa destructor, the bees that he's found in the wild manage that parasite perfectly fine. It's not causing beehives in the wild to collapse the way they are in managed, sort of human managed situations, which, I mean, this is not really that surprising that the bees in the wild on their own are capable of doing much better than we as humans can do it. But that's an interesting thing to look into. The Bees, the novel, is actually a fiction novel, but it is told from the perspective of a bee, beginning with sort of the hatching of the bee and then moving from there. And it is a really fun novel, and it actually does very closely mirror what I talked about today in terms of the actual life cycle of a bee. So that's a really kind of interesting and fun one. Common Sense Natural Beekeeping, Kim Flodham has written a couple books about beekeeping. The other one is The Backyard Beekeeper. She was editor for many years of Bee Culture magazine, which is sort of the major beekeeping kind of publication. But this idea of natural beekeeping is kind of building on what I mentioned with Thomas Seeley of a direction for beekeepers to go that is, closer to the way that beekeepers would like to be in the wild, that bees would like to be in the wild. And I've been told that her books are also interesting, even if you're not a beekeeper, if you're just interested in learning more about bees. The two down in the lower left that are by Nancy Lawson, The Humane Gardener and Wildscape. These are two, she is definitely a proponent of that sort of ecological gardening and that approach of considering all of the organisms that live in your particular habitat, not just you as the human. Some other things that I also enjoy, if you like gardening, if you like pollinators, if you like organic gardening, you might want to check out the Joe Gardner podcast if you don't already. He has some really wonderful speakers on there, amazing topics, everything from diving deep into an hour-long discussion of compost to a lot about pollinators and a lot about ecological gardening. So I've really enjoyed his podcasts. And if you have any small humans in your life, I put a little sampling of picture books that I enjoy and I read with my family. So they're down there as well. So that's the end of my formal remarks, and we can open up to questions if I can find my mouse here.